Hello. Before we begin, I need you to understand something about small towns in West Virginia. We're not backward or superstitious, at least not in the way outsiders think. When your family has lived in the same holler for 8 generations, when your great-great-grandmother's bones rest under stones you walk past every Sunday, you learn things. You inherit knowledge that doesn't fit neatly into police reports or rational explanations. If this story resonates with you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share your own experiences in the comments below. I read every single one, and knowing I'm not alone in this helps more than you might imagine. Now let me tell you about the town where I've worn a badge for 18 years, and the thing that comes for us every January. My name is Jameson Hargrove, though everyone calls me Jamie. I'm the sheriff of Ashwood Hollow, West Virginia. Population 847 on a good day. Fewer when you account for folks who winter down in Charleston or those too old to leave their homesteads. Our town sits in a fold of the Allegheny Mountains, surrounded by forests so thick that GPS signals die half a mile outside the town limits. The nearest highway is 40 minutes of winding mountain roads, and the last chain store that tried opening here closed within 6 months. We like it that way. I grew up in the house where my grandfather grew up. 3 generations of Hargroves wore the sheriff's badge, keeping the peace in a place where everyone knew each other's business, where feuds had been simmering for decades but rarely erupted, and where the worst crimes were usually young people getting drunk on moonshine and river water. This is the kind of town where you don't lock your doors, where a handshake is worth more than a contract, and where neighbors bring food when someone is sick. It's also the kind of town where certain things don't get discussed with outsiders. My first week as deputy. This was back in 2007, when my father was still sheriff and his hands hadn't yet started shaking from a Parkinson's. He sat me down in his office and pulled out a leather journal. The binding was cracked, the pages yellow with age, and the handwriting changed every few dozen entries. I recognized my grandfather's script, then my father's, then others I didn't know. "This doesn't leave this room," he said, sliding it across the desk. "Every sheriff since 1843 has kept these records. Now it's your turn to read them." The journal had no official title, but someone had written on the first page in faded ink, "Occurrences during the thin times." I spent that entire night reading. By dawn, I'd learned that Ashwood Hollow harbored something that couldn't be explained, couldn't be fought with guns or logic, and absolutely could not be ignored. My father had written extensively about the autumn of 1989. My grandfather documented the nightmare of 1954. Before them, sheriffs whose names I'd seen on headstones in the Baptist cemetery described encounters stretching back to the Civil War. They all told variations of the same story. Every year, starting on January 15th and ending on February 1st, what the old-timers called the thin times, people began seeing things, hearing things, and sometimes they disappeared. The rules had been developed over generations, written in blood and grief and hard-learned wisdom. They weren't suggestions. They were survival protocols refined through 180 years of trial and error, of mistakes that cost lives and strategies that saved them. 7 rules. I committed them to memory before the sun rose that morning. Rule 1. Never investigate missing persons reports during thin times alone. The journal was full of entries describing deputies, sheriffs, even state police officers who'd gone into the woods by themselves to search for someone reported missing. Very few came back. Those who did were changed in ways that defied medical explanation. They aged 20 years overnight, or forgot their own names, or spoke in voices that weren't quite their own. One deputy in 1923 returned after 3 days with no memory of where he'd been, claiming he'd only been gone for an hour. He died 6 weeks later, still insisting it was January 15th. Rule 2. If you find backwards footprints, do not follow them. This one appeared in entries dating back to the 1850s. The footprints always showed up in soft earth near the tree line, perfectly formed boot prints or bare feet pointing away from the forest when logic said they should point toward it. Following them led searchers deeper into woods that somehow became unfamiliar, even to people who'd hunted there their entire lives. Trees rearranged themselves. Landmarks vanished. Compasses spun. Those who made it back described walking in circles for hours, always seeing those backwards prints just ahead, always feeling watched by something that breathed but never appeared. Rule 3. When someone claims to have seen a dead relative, quarantine them for 72 hours. My grandfather's section was heavy on this rule. He'd learned it the hard way in 1954, when a woman named Dorothy Keene saw her husband, 3 years dead from black lung, standing at the edge of her property. She ran to him. That night, she knocked on her neighbor's door and said her husband wanted the neighbor to come say hello, that he'd been waiting all these years to make amends for a borrowed tool never returned. The neighbor went. Neither were seen again. The quarantine wasn't imprisonment. It was protection. Whatever appeared wearing the faces of the dead, it needed an invitation. It needed someone to willingly follow. Rule 4. The old coal mine Blacklick Shaft is off-limits after sunset year-round. Blacklick had been closed since 1962 after a collapse killed 11 men. The entrance was sealed with concrete and steel, posted with warnings and fences. But during thin times, people reported hearing pickaxes ringing against stone, voices singing work songs, the rumble of mine cars on rails that had been torn out decades ago. Teenagers on dares had tried to break through the seal. Some succeeded. None returned before dawn, and when they did, they refused to speak about what they'd seen in the dark. One boy in 1998 had to be institutionalized. He'd draw the same image over and over, a tunnel that bent wrong, leading to a place where dead miners still worked their shifts. Rule 5. If a child draws the tall man with no face, remove them from town immediately. Children saw it first. Always children under 10, still young enough that their minds hadn't yet learned what was possible and what wasn't. They'd wake from nightmares and draw pictures of a figure too tall to fit through doorways, with arms that reached the ground and a head that had features you couldn't quite focus on. My father's entries described 4 instances where parents ignored this warning. In each case, the child vanished within a week. The drawings were found in the empty bedrooms, but the images had changed. Now the tall figure stood beside a smaller shape, and both were smiling with mouths that had too many teeth. Rule 6. Never speak the name of someone who disappeared during thin times. This was the hardest rule to follow. When someone you knew, someone you'd shared Sunday dinners with, vanished into the January woods, every instinct screamed to call their name, to organize search parties, to post their picture on every telephone pole. But the journal was clear. Speaking their name gave power to whatever had taken them. It created a link. People who insisted on searching for disappeared loved ones, who called out those names in the forest, who refused to accept loss, they disappeared too. The only mercy was forgetting. Let them go silently, and you might be spared. Rule 7. The Cherokee warnings carved on elder oak are not decorative. Elder oak stood at the center of town, older than any building, so massive that it took 8 men holding hands to circle its trunk. My grandmother, my mother's mother, full-blooded Cherokee, had taught me to read the symbols carved deep into its bark. They weren't made by settlers. They'd been there longer than European memory in these mountains. The symbols told a story of something that had lived in these hills long before humans arrived. Something that got hungry when the barrier between worlds grew thin. Something that wore whatever shape it needed to lure prey away from safety. My grandmother called it Uktana, though that wasn't quite right. The Cherokee had a word for it that translated roughly to the thing that hollows you out. But in Ashwood Hollow, people called it the hollow thing. I'll be honest, when I first read these rules, I thought they were folk tales. Colorful local mythology kept alive by isolation and too much inbreeding. I had a degree in criminal justice from West Virginia University. I'd studied forensic science, criminal psychology, evidence collection. I believed in things I could measure and explain. Then came January of 2007, my first autumn as deputy, and belief became irrelevant. The hollow thing didn't care what I believed. It only cared that I followed the rules, or suffered the consequences. January 15th dawned cold and gray that year. I remember because I'd been planning to take my daughter Carrie, she was 6 then, to the pumpkin patch over in Kanawha County. But that morning, Martha Greer called the station in tears. Her boy Tommy hadn't come home from a camping trip with his friends. 3 boys, all 17, had gone up to Porter's Ridge to celebrate the start of fall break. Tommy was supposed to be back by dinner time on the 14th. It was now morning, and Martha's calls to his cell went straight to voicemail. I found my father in his office, already dressed in his uniform despite it being a Saturday, staring at the journal laid open on his desk. "I know," he said before I could speak. "Martha called me first. I told her we'd look." He stood, and I saw how much effort it took, how his hands gripped the desk edge for support. "This is it, Jamie. Your first thin times as a lawman. Everything changes now." We took 2 vehicles, my Tahoe and my father's old Ford pickup, and drove the fire roads up to Porter's Ridge. The January woods were gorgeous, leaves turning gold and crimson, morning mist clinging to the hollows like smoke. Beautiful enough to make you forget that beauty and danger aren't opposites in these mountains. We found the boys' campsite easily enough. The tent was still standing, sleeping bags laid out neatly, a cold fire ring with half-burned logs. Nothing looked disturbed. Their backpacks were there, phones and wallets inside. A cooler held sandwiches and beer, untouched. But the boys were gone. "Stay close," my father said, his voice tight. "Follow Rule 1. We searched in widening circles, calling out, watching for any sign. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the soft earth near a stream. Boot prints, the right size for teenage boys. But they pointed the wrong way. They pointed away from camp, backwards, as if someone had walked in reverse toward the tree line. "Don't," my father said sharply when I took a step toward them. "That's Rule 2, son. Whatever made those tracks wants you to follow. The boys made their own choices. We can't help them if we're taken too." We searched until dusk, following protocols my father had learned from his father. We stayed within shouting distance. We marked our trail. We didn't follow the backwards prints, even when they appeared again and again, leading deeper into the forest. We didn't find the boys. That night, back at the station, my father updated the journal. 3 names added to a list that stretched back generations: Tommy Greer, Jason Billings, Wade Kowalski. Last seen January 14, 2007. Footprints found. Direction impossible. Status: lost to thin times. That's it. I demanded. "We're just going to write them off? Stop searching." "No," my father said quietly. "We'll keep looking. But we'll do it smart. We'll do it safe. Because that's what those boys would want, for us to live, even if they can't." Martha Greer never forgave us for stopping the search. She moved away that winter, couldn't stand to see the town where her son had vanished. I couldn't blame her. What I couldn't tell her, what I couldn't make her understand, was that following those backwards prints would have meant more mothers weeping, more names in the journal, more fuel for the hollow thing's hunger. 3 boys were gone. It wanted more. It always wanted more during thin times. But that was just the beginning. On January 17th, old Bill Hutchkins walked into the station, face pale as milk, hands shaking. Bill was 73, tough as boot leather, a Korean War veteran who'd survived things that would break younger men. But he looked broken now, confused and terrified in equal measure. "Sheriff," he said to my father, "I need to report a trespasser. My wife's on my property." "Your wife?" I glanced at my father, who'd gone very still. "Elizabeth. She's standing in the backyard, right by the garden shed. Been there since dawn." Bill's voice cracked. "But Sheriff, Elizabeth's been dead 9 years. I buried her myself, put her next to her mother in Riverside Cemetery. I know she's dead, but she's standing in my yard right now, clear as day, wearing the blue dress I buried her in." My father closed his eyes. "Sit down, Bill. Jamie, get him water." "I'm not crazy, Hargrove. I know what I saw." "I believe you." My father opened his eyes, and I saw the weight of knowledge there, the burden of understanding things that shouldn't be true. "Jamie, call Mrs. Henderson. Tell her we need the quarantine room ready. And call Doc Stevens. Tell him it's a Rule 3 situation." Bill Hutchkins spent the next 72 hours in what we called the quarantine room, really just a spare bedroom in elderly Constance Henderson's boarding house. Comfortable, but secure. We told anyone who asked that Bill was having dizzy spells, that Doc Stevens wanted him under observation. Bill understood. He'd lived in Ashwood Hollow his whole life. He knew the rules, even if he'd never expected to experience them firsthand. On the third day, he came back to the station, still shaken but lucid. "She's gone," he told us. "I went home this morning. The yard's empty." "But Sheriff," his voice dropped to a whisper, "I heard her calling me last night. From the woods behind my house. She used my name, the special name she only called me when we were alone. And she said she wanted to show me something. Something wonderful. Something I had to see before I died. Said she'd been waiting 9 years to show me, and couldn't I come just for a minute? Just to see." "But you didn't go," my father said. "I didn't go." Bill's hands clenched into fists. "Because it wasn't her. Couldn't have been. Elizabeth never called me by that name in front of other people. It was private, intimate. Whatever was out there in the woods, it knew things it shouldn't know. It was wearing her face like a mask, and the mask didn't quite fit right." We added Bill's report to the journal. Elizabeth Hutchkins' name went in a special section, faces worn by the hollow thing. There were dozens of names there, spanning decades. Parents, spouses, children, friends, all dead, all buried, all seen walking the edges of Ashwood Hollow during thin times, calling to the living with voices that almost but not quite matched memory. 3 days later, we got another call. A different situation, but equally wrong. Paula Vance taught 2nd grade at Ashwood Elementary. She'd been at the school for 22 years, knew every family in town, was the kind of teacher who remembered your birthday decades after you'd left her classroom. When she called the station at 3 p.m. on January 21st, she wasn't crying or panicking. Her voice was calm, professional, terrifying in its composure. "Sheriff Hargrove, this is Paula. I need you to come to the school right away, and bring your father if he's available. We have a Rule 5 situation." My father was having a bad day, the Parkinson's making his hand shake so badly he could barely hold a coffee cup. But he insisted on coming. "Rule 5, he muttered as we drove to the school. God help us. I was hoping we'd get through one autumn without a Rule 5. Paula met us at the door, her face carefully neutral in the way adults get when they're trying not to frighten children. She led us to her classroom, where a little girl sat alone at a table, crayons scattered around her. The girl, I recognized her as Bethany Price, 7 years old, daughter of the mechanic who ran the garage on Route 19, was drawing with fierce concentration, tongue stuck out in focus. "She's been drawing that same picture all day," Paula said quietly. "Won't draw anything else. Won't talk about it. Just keeps making the same image over and over." I looked at the papers scattered across the table. There were at least 20 drawings, all identical, all showing a tall figure, impossibly tall, stretched like taffy, standing in front of a house I recognized as the Price family home. The figure had no face. Where features should have been, there was just blank space, as if the artist had forgotten to finish. But the hands were detailed. Fingers long and spindly, reaching down toward a smaller figure. The smaller figure was unmistakably Bethany. And in every picture, both figures were smiling with mouths that curved too wide, revealing too many teeth arranged in spiral rows. My father turned to Paula. "When did she start?" "During free time, about 10 a.m. She asked me if I'd ever seen the tall man who lived in the woods. I said no, and she said he'd been visiting her room at night for the past week. Said he stands by her window and watches her sleep. Said he's very quiet and very patient, and he promises he'll show her wonderful things if she'll just come with him after dark." Paula's composure cracked slightly. "Sheriff, I've known Bethany since she was in kindergarten. She doesn't lie. She doesn't have an imagination that runs to dark things. This isn't a story. This is something she's experienced." We called Bethany's parents, explained the situation as delicately as possible. There was no delicate way to tell someone their child had been marked by something ancient and hungry. That staying in town meant watching her disappear. That the only option was to pack up and leave immediately, no questions asked. To their credit, Mike and Jennifer Price didn't argue. They'd lived in Ashwood Hollow long enough to know that when the sheriff invoked the rules, you listened. By evening, they were on the road to Jennifer's sister's place in Tennessee. The last I saw of Bethany, she was sleeping in the back seat, her drawings left behind in a folder that went into my father's safe. I pulled one out later, studying it by lamplight. The tall man with no face. The hollow thing. Whatever you called it. The image made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't articulate. It was wrong in fundamental ways that bypassed reason and went straight to instinct. The same instinct that made our ancestors fear the dark, that made children hide under blankets, that made grown men walk faster past graveyards at night. 5 incidents in 6 days, my father said, updating the journal. That's more than usual. It's getting bolder, I suggested. Or hungrier. He looked at me, and I saw fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for me. For the burden I'd eventually inherit. Same thing, son. For the hollow thing, they're the same thing. January wore on. The thin times deepened. Every day brought new strangeness, new violations of the natural order. Hunters reported finding deer with their insides scooped out, but no blood, arranged in circles in the woods. Hikers got lost on trails they'd walked 100 times, rescued hours later with no memory of where they'd been. Dogs refused to go outside after dark, whining and cowering even when their owners commanded them. Birds stopped singing. The usual sounds of forest life, rustling leaves, distant owls, wind through branches, all faded to an unnatural silence that made your ears ring. And every night, someone reported seeing loved ones who shouldn't exist. Standing at the edges of yards. Calling from the tree line. Visible in the split second between closing your eyes and opening them. The quarantine room stayed occupied. Doc Stevens started sleeping at his office, ready for the inevitable calls. My father's health declined rapidly. The stress of thin times always hit him hard, but this year was worse. By January 27th, he could barely stand, the tremors so violent that he had to dictate his journal entries while I wrote. Deputy Alice Cordell and I handled most of the calls, always in pairs, always following Rule 1. It was Alice who found the next victim. Though victim isn't quite the right word for what we discovered on January 29th. A caller who refused to give their name reported something strange near the Blacklick shaft. Alice and I drove out, arriving just before sunset, that golden hour when shadows stretch long and the boundary between day and night becomes uncertain. The mine entrance was still sealed, concrete still intact. But at the base of the seal, someone had dug a hole. Not large, maybe 2 feet across, but deep enough that our flashlights couldn't find the bottom. And around that hole, arranged in a careful circle, were 7 objects. A wedding ring. A child's shoe. A pocket watch. A pair of glasses. A coin. A photograph. And a knife. Alice knelt to examine them without touching. These are old, she said. Really old. That pocket watch is pre-1900. And the photo, she leaned closer, it's a tintype. Civil War era, maybe. I crouched beside her. The items were dusty but well preserved, arranged with obvious intention. And in the center of the circle, pressed into the dirt, was a handprint. A handprint with 6 fingers, each one too long and bent at too many joints. We need to leave, I said. Right now. But Alice was staring past me, her face gone slack. Jamie, look at the mine entrance. I turned slowly, knowing I wouldn't like what I saw. Words had appeared on the concrete seal. Not written, carved, as if someone had dragged impossibly sharp claws through solid stone. The letters were rough but legible, spelling out a message that made my blood run cold. 3 days left. 7 debts unpaid. The hollow demands what's owed. We documented everything with photographs, collected the items for evidence, and were back in our vehicles before full darkness fell. But driving away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following. The road behind us remained empty. But that somehow felt worse than if something had actually been there. That night, I sat with my father in his kitchen, both of us too wired to sleep. He'd declined rapidly in the past week, looking more like 83 than 63, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold a whiskey glass. "The hollow thing is escalating," he said. 7 deaths. That's never happened before. What does it mean? I asked. I don't know. That's what scares me. He gestured weakly at the journal, which I'd brought with me. Read the entry from 1843. The very first one. I found the page. The handwriting was archaic, difficult to decipher, but I made out the words. It came in January of this year, as it has come in Januaries past, as the Cherokee warned it would. 7 of us entered the mine, seeking shelter from its pursuit. 7 of us made a pact, inscribed in blood on stone, promising we would feed it nothing, starve it until it grew weak and left our hollow. We kept that promise. But the thing does not forget debts. It does not forgive broken bargains. And now it waits, patient as stone, for payment that was promised but never delivered. The entry ended there. No signature. No explanation of what promise had been made, or why. Every generation, my father said softly, we've managed to keep most people safe by following the rules. But the rules weren't made by us. They were made by that first sheriff, whoever he was, after he and 6 others survived something in that mine. Something that should have killed them. Something they bargained with. You think it's coming to collect? I think it never stopped trying to collect. The hollow thing takes people every thin times because we still owe it. We owe it 7. He met my eyes. And I think this year, it's decided to stop being patient. 3 days left until February 1st. 3 days until the thin times ended and the barrier between worlds solidified again. 3 days to figure out what promise had been made 164 years ago, and what price we'd have to pay to survive this January. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table reading every entry in the journal, looking for patterns, clues, anything that might help me understand what was coming. My wife, Angela, gave up trying to convince me to come to bed around 2 a.m. She knew better than to argue when thin times made me obsessive. Around 4 a.m., I found something. A notation in my grandfather's section, dated January 30th, 1954, the year he'd lost 12 people to the hollow thing. The worst autumn in the journal's history. It wants names, not just bodies. Names. The 7 who made the original pact wrote their names in the mine, bound themselves to a promise. The thing takes people at random because it can't find those specific names anymore. But every person it takes, it checks. It's searching. One day, it will find a descendant of those 7 original families. And when it does, the debt will be paid in full. I stared at those words as dawn light crept through my windows. 7 original families. 7 debts. And I was a Hargrove, a family that had been in Ashwood Hollow since before the Civil War. Morning arrived without my having slept. Angela found me still hunched over the journal, circling names, drawing connections between families mentioned across generations. She set coffee beside me without comment. 15 years of marriage had taught her when silence offered more comfort than conversation. "The prices left safely?" she asked, standing at the window where weak January sunlight filtered through our kitchen curtains. "Made it to Tennessee 2 nights ago. Jennifer texted yesterday." Bethany's nightmares stopped the moment they crossed the state line. Angela nodded, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Our daughter Carrie was still asleep upstairs, blissfully ignorant of the wrongness seeping into our town. Angela and I had decided years ago to shield her from the truth as long as possible. Let her believe in a world where monsters stayed in storybooks. "Jamie," Angela said quietly, still facing the window. "Whatever you're planning, whatever you think you need to do, promise me you'll come home." I couldn't make that promise. We both knew it. Instead, I kissed her temple and headed to the station, the journal heavy in my messenger bag. Alice was already there, looking as exhausted as I felt. She'd pinned a map of Ashwood Hollow to the wall, red markers indicating every incident we documented since January 15th. The pattern was obvious once visualized, a rough circle centered on the old town square, with the blacklick shaft sitting dead center. "I've been going through property records," she said without preamble, trying to identify the 7 families mentioned in that first journal entry. It's not easy. Most records from before 1850 are incomplete, and family names change through marriage. But I found something interesting. She tapped 7 points on the map, each marked with a different colored pin. These 7 properties form a perfect heptagon around the shaft. Too precise to be coincidence. And all 7 were owned by founding families: Hargrove, Hutchkins, Cordell, Vance, Greer, Billings, and Kowalski. The names hit me like physical blows. Those are families who've lost people this January, I said slowly. Tommy Greer, Jason Billings, Wade Kowalski, the boys from Porter's Ridge. Bill Hutchkins saw his dead wife. Paula Vance reported the Rule 5 situation. You're a Hargrove. Alice pointed at her chest. And I'm a Cordell. That's 6 families. Who's the 7th? I couldn't find definitive proof, but circumstantial evidence points to the Henderson family. Constance Henderson, who runs the boarding house. The woman who's provided our quarantine room. The woman who'd lived in Ashwood Hollow for 83 years. Who remembered things the rest of us had forgotten. Who kept Cherokee traditions alive when most of the indigenous population had been driven west generations ago. We need to talk to her, I said. She's expecting us, Alice replied. I called an hour ago. Constance Henderson's boarding house occupied a Victorian structure that predated most of Ashwood Hollow's current buildings. 3 stories of gingerbread trim and widow's walks, maintained with obsessive care despite its owner's advanced age. The locals whispered that the house itself was older than town records suggested, that it had stood on that spot long before white settlers arrived. Constance met us on the porch, wrapped in a shawl despite the mild morning temperature. She was tiny, barely 5 feet, but possessed the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten their spines. Cherokee blood showed clearly in her features, though she told me once that only a quarter of her ancestry traced to the tribes that had inhabited these mountains. Coffee's hot, she said, leading us into a parlor that smelled of old wood and lavender. And before you ask, yes, I know why you're here. I've been waiting for someone to put the pieces together for 60 years. We settled into chairs that had probably witnessed a century of conversations. Constance poured coffee from a silver service that seemed incongruous with the gravity of our visit. The 7 families made a deal with something that should never be bargained with, she began without prompting. This was 1843, January. A hunting party went into the mine. It wasn't properly established yet, just some test shafts checking for coal deposits. They went in seeking shelter from a storm. What they found instead was a door that shouldn't exist. A door. Alice leaned forward. Not a door in the physical sense. A weak point between this world and someplace else. The Cherokee knew about it. That's why they avoided this valley, why they considered it cursed ground. But the white settlers didn't listen to warnings in languages they refused to learn. Constance sipped her coffee, her hands steady despite her age. Something came through that weak point. Something old and hungry and very, very patient. It took the shape of their fears, their guilts, their lost loved ones. It hunted them through the mine tunnels for 3 days. But they survived. They bargained, I said. 7 men, each representing their family line, each carving their name into the stone with their own blood. They promised the entity 7 lives in exchange for being allowed to leave. 7 souls to feed it, to let it fully cross into our world and take physical form. Jesus Christ, Alice breathed. They never intended to honor the deal, of course. They sealed the mine entrance, tried to forget what they'd encountered, tried to convince themselves it was hallucination brought on by bad air and fear. Constance set down her cup. But the hollow thing doesn't forget. It can't fully manifest without those 7 willing sacrifices, but it's strong enough during thin times, when the barriers grow weak anyway, to reach through. To take substitutes. It's been collecting interest on that debt for 164 years. Why didn't anyone stop it? I demanded. Why didn't previous sheriffs do something? What would you suggest? You can't shoot a thing that isn't fully in this world. You can't arrest an entity that predates human law. The best they could do was develop rules to minimize casualties, to help people survive each January. Constance's eyes bored into mine. Until now. The hollow thing has been taking random victims because it can't find the exact bloodlines it needs, Alice said slowly. But this year is different. The 7 families have all been marked, I finished. Not just identified. Cold. Constance stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the January landscape. It knows you're here. All 7 bloodlines, still living in Ashwood Hollow after all these generations. It's patient, but its patience has limits. This year, it's demanding the original bargain be fulfilled. So we leave, I said. All 7 families. We evacuate. Go somewhere else until February 1st passes. It won't work. Constance turned back to us. The hollow thing has invested too much energy in this year's manifestation. If you flee, it will follow. And worse, it will be angry. It will stop taking substitutes and start taking everyone. Your families, your friends, anyone connected to you. The entire town could be consumed. Alice had gone pale. Then what do we do? You honor the bargain. Constance said it simply, as if suggesting we pay an overdue library fine rather than sacrifice ourselves to an ancient entity. 7 willing souls, walking into the mine of their own volition. That's what was promised. That's what it requires to fully cross over, and finally leave this world satisfied. That's insane, I said flatly. You're suggesting we commit suicide. I'm suggesting you save hundreds of lives by offering 7. It's brutal mathematics, Sheriff, but it's the only mathematics that matters. Constance moved back to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 83 years. I've prepared everything you'll need. Instructions left by my grandmother, who learned them from the Cherokee wise woman who warned the original settlers. Rituals that can bind the hollow thing once it manifests. Trap it long enough for the sacrifices to be completed and the bargain fulfilled. After that, it will be sated. It will return to wherever it came from, and Ashwood Hollow will finally be free. How do you know it will keep its word? Alice asked. Because that's what such entities do. They're bound by rules older than human civilization. Break a bargain, and you give them permission to take anything. Honor a bargain, even one as terrible as this, and they have no choice but to accept it and leave. Constance pulled a folded cloth from her pocket, revealing 7 objects: a ring, a coin, a key, a button, a nail, a piece of bone and a tooth. These belonged to the original 7. They've been passed down through the families, often without the inheritors knowing their significance. I've spent my life collecting them, waiting for the year when they'd be needed. I recognized the ring. It had been my father's, passed down from his father. Supposedly a Hargrove family heirloom from the Civil War era. I thought it was just a keepsake, a connection to ancestors I'd never met. My father wore that ring, I said, my voice hollow. He had it on when he died last year. I know. I asked permission to take it from his body before the funeral. He would have understood why. Constance wrapped the objects back in the cloth. You have until midnight on January 31st. That's when the barriers are thinnest, when the hollow thing will be strongest. You gather the 7 bloodlines at the Blacklick shaft. You open the seal. You walk into the darkness carrying these tokens, speaking the words I'll teach you, and you give it what was promised 164 years ago. Alice stood abruptly. This is medieval superstition. We're law enforcement officers in the 21st century. There has to be another way. If you find one, I'll be the first to celebrate. Constance met her gaze without flinching. But I've seen 6 thin times, Deputy Cordell. I've watched good people disappear. I've read accounts going back to 1843. This entity doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It takes what it's owed, or takes everything trying to collect. We left with a cloth bundle and a handwritten set of instructions that read like something from a horror novel. Alice drove us back to the station in silence, both of us processing the impossible choice we'd been handed. We can't tell people, she said finally. If we announce that 7 families need to walk into a cursed mine to prevent some ancient monster from consuming the town, we'll start a panic that kills more people than the hollow thing ever could. Agreed. But we also can't make this decision alone. We need to contact the other families, explain what's happening, let them choose. Choose death versus everyone dying? Alice's laugh was bitter. That's not a choice. That's an ultimatum dressed in ethics. We spent the rest of the day tracking down representatives from each bloodline. Some were easy. Bill Hutchkins was still recovering from his Rule 3 quarantine. Martha Greer had returned to town for Tommy's memorial service. Paula Vance was at the school. Others took longer to locate. By evening, we'd assembled 6 people in the station's conference room. Bill Hutchkins, 73. Martha Greer, 48. Paula Vance, 56. Donovan Billings, Jason's father, 45. Christina Kowalski, Wade's grandmother, 81. And myself, 41. Alice, representing the Cordell line, made 7. I explained everything. The journal entries. Constance's revelations. The bargain made in 1843. The impossible choice we faced. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. By the time I finished, the room had grown dark outside, and the only sound was Christina Kowalski's quiet weeping. My grandson, she said in her heavy accent, Polish immigrant parents having raised her speaking more of the old country than the new. Wade was such good boy. Always helping, always smiling. He'd disappear in those woods because of old promise. Her tears stopped, replaced by something harder. Then I pay this debt gladly. For Wade. For all the children taken by this thing. Mrs. Kowalski, you don't have to, Alice began. I do. The old woman's voice broke no argument. I am 81 years. I have lived full life. But Wade was 17. How many more 17-year-olds must die before someone stops this? She looked around the table. Who else will go into darkness with me? Martha Greer spoke next, her voice flat with the grief that had never left since Tommy vanished. I've already lost my son. What else matters? If dying stops this thing from taking other people's children, then dying seems like the least I can do. I'll go, Bill Hutchkins said. Korean War taught me something about sacrifices, about doing hard things so others don't have to. Besides, I'm an old man with no family left. Elizabeth is waiting for me, the real Elizabeth. Maybe this is how I finally get to see her again. Paula Vance nodded slowly. I've taught 2 generations of Ashwood Hollow children. Watched them grow, marry, have their own kids. If I can protect them by walking into that mine, then that's what teachers do. We protect our students. Donovan Billings had been silent throughout, staring at his hands. Jason was my only child, he said finally. My wife died giving birth to him. He was everything I had left in this world. If there's even a chance that going into that mine means other fathers won't lose their sons. His voice broke. Then I'm going. 5 volunteers. 5 people willing to walk into death to save a town. I looked at Alice, saw the same conflict I felt reflected in her eyes. I have a daughter, I said. Carrie's only 6. She needs her father. My girls are grown, Alice countered. Married, living in other states. They'll grieve, but they'll survive. Your Carrie won't understand why Daddy never came home. Which is exactly why I have to go, I said firmly. So she can grow up in a world where January doesn't mean terror. So she never has to learn about the hollow thing, or thin times, or any of this nightmare. Jamie. It's decided. I turned to the group. We're still 1 short. 7 bloodlines, 7 sacrifices. The Henderson line hasn't been represented. I'll speak to Constance, Bill Hutchkins said. If anyone understands duty, it's her. We arranged to meet at the Blacklick Shaft at 11 p.m. on January 31st, 1 hour before the barriers would be thinnest, giving us time for the rituals Constance had described. Alice would stay behind to coordinate emergency services if something went wrong, to make sure our families were protected, to keep the journal updated with the final chapter in this long story. I spent the next day with my family. Took Carrie to the park, pushed her on swings, caught her at the bottom of slides, let her win at hide and seek. Angela watched with knowing eyes, but said nothing. Just held my hand tighter than usual, her thumb tracing the wedding ring I'd never removed in 15 years. That night, after Carrie fell asleep, Angela and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Promise that if you don't come back, you'll find a way to let me know you're at peace. A sign. Something that tells me you're not suffering in that darkness. I promise. And promise that you'll forgive me for not stopping you. For letting you go. For being too much of a coward to argue harder." I rolled to face her, saw tears tracking down her temples into her hair. "You're not a coward. You're the bravest person I know. Letting someone you love do something dangerous because it's necessary, that takes more courage than anyone should have to possess." We made love then, desperate and clinging, as if we could anchor each other to this world through sheer force of touch. Afterward, I held her until she slept, memorizing the sound of her breathing, the warmth of her body, the smell of her shampoo, storing memories against the darkness ahead. January 31st arrived cold and clear. A perfect time, kids would be saying. Perfect for trick-or-treating. The town had canceled its usual festivities. The thin times made people cautious about wandering after dark, but a few families still carved pumpkins, still put out decorations, still tried to maintain normalcy. I spent the day filing paperwork, writing letters for Angela and Carrie to read later, updating my will. Alice hovered nearby, arguing periodically that she should be the one to go, that her sacrifice made more logical sense. I ignored her. Some decisions, once made, can't be unmade. At 7 p.m., Constance arrived at the station with Bill Hutchkins. "The Henderson line will be represented," she said simply. "I'll be going with you." "Mrs. Henderson, you don't have to." "Young man, I've been preparing for this moment since I was old enough to understand what my grandmother told me about the hollow thing. This is my duty, my purpose. Let me fulfill it with dignity." At 10 p.m., we gathered outside the station. 7 people representing 7 bloodlines, each carrying one of the ancestral tokens Constance had collected. She'd spent the day teaching us the words we'd need to speak, the gestures we'd need to make, ancient Cherokee syllables mixed with other languages I didn't recognize, sounds that hurt my throat to form. Martha Greer had brought Tommy's favorite baseball cap. Donovan Billings carried one of Jason's guitar picks. Christina Kowalski clutched Wade's class ring. Bill Hutchkins held a photograph of Elizabeth. Paula Vance had a locket given to her by her grandmother. Constance wore a medicine bag that had belonged to her Cherokee ancestor. And I carried my father's ring, warm from my pocket. Alice hugged each of us in turn. When she reached me, she held on longer than necessary. "Don't you dare become a ghost that calls people from the woods," she whispered. "I'll break Rule 6 just to yell at you. I'll do my best to avoid that particular fate." We walked through Ashwood Hollow's empty streets, past shuttered shops and dark houses, toward the old Blacklick shaft. The night was silent except for our footsteps and the distant sound of a dog howling. The moon hung fat and orange overhead, a harvest moon that seemed to watch our procession with malevolent interest. The mine entrance loomed ahead, concrete seal intact. The hole someone had dug at its base now widened to person-sized proportions. And around that hole, etched in the earth by methods I didn't want to contemplate, were symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. Constance began the ritual. She knelt and drew additional symbols in the dirt with a stick dipped in something dark. I hoped it was ink, but suspected it wasn't. The rest of us formed a circle, holding our tokens, repeating the words she taught us. The syllables felt wrong in my mouth, like they were reshaping my tongue to forms it wasn't meant to take. The temperature dropped. Breath frosted. The symbols began to glow with a light that hurt to observe. And from the hole at the base of the mine seal, something began to emerge. What came out of that hole wasn't a creature in any traditional sense. It was wrongness given form. A violation of natural law that made my eyes water and my stomach clench. The hollow thing didn't crawl or climb. It simply existed outside the hole, then inside our circle, occupying space without having traveled through it. At first glance, it resembled a person, tall, impossibly tall, easily 8 feet, with a hunched posture that suggested it could unfold to even greater heights. Limbs bent at joints that shouldn't exist. Fingers that tapered to points like sharpened pencils. The head sat at an angle no living spine could support, and where a face should have been, there was only smooth skin stretched tight over bone, like someone had pulled a stocking over their features and tied it off at the back. But that was just what my brain insisted on seeing, the nearest approximation to something comprehensible. When I glanced at it peripherally, the shape changed. Sometimes multiple figures overlapping. Sometimes a darkness so complete it seemed to devour light. Sometimes a mass of writhing shapes that might have been arms or tentacles or something else entirely. Christina Kowalski made a sound low in her throat, half prayer, half keen. I realized she was seeing something different than I was. Probably Wade, or some twisted version of him. The hollow thing showed each of us our own personal horror, customized to exploit individual fears and guilts. Constance continued the chant, her voice steady despite the entity looming over us. The symbols glowed brighter, forming lines of light that connected in geometric patterns I couldn't follow. The hollow thing tested these boundaries like a wild animal testing fence wire, pressing against the glowing lines but not crossing them. "We come to honor the bargain made in 1843, Constance said, switching to English. 7 bloodlines, 7 willing souls. The debt unpaid becomes debt fulfilled. We offer what was promised so long ago." The hollow thing tilted its knot head, regarding us with attention. I felt like physical pressure. When it spoke, the sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that bypassed ears and resonated directly in my skull. Names. One by one, we spoke our names and lineage. Bill Hutchkins, descended from Thomas Hutchkins, who'd made the original bargain. Martha Greer, whose maiden name was Morrison, traced back to one of the 7. Donovan Billings, direct line clear as day in old church records. Christina Kowalski, married into the family, but carrying their blood through her son and grandson. Paula Vance, whose family tree stretched back to the founding of Ashwood Hollow. Constance Henderson, Cherokee grandmother married to a man named Henderson, both bloodlines converging in her. And me, Jameson Hargrove, 3rd-generation sheriff, great-great-great-grandson of Joshua Hargrove, who'd carved his name in blood inside this very mine. The hollow thing seemed to taste each name, rolling them around in whatever passed for its consciousness. I felt it probing my thoughts, my memories, confirming that yes, I was who I claimed to be. Yes, my blood carried the signature of the original bargain. 7 names. 7 souls. 7 willing. A pause that stretched too long. But one is false. The circle of light wavered. Constance's chanting faltered. What? I managed to force out through a throat gone tight with fear. One name does not match. One bloodline was not part of the original 7. The entity moved, or seemed to move, hard to tell when it occupied space in nonlinear fashion, stopping before Bill Hutchkins. This one. Hutchkins. The name is correct, but the blood is wrong. Bill staggered backward, face draining of color. That's impossible. My family's been in Ashwood Hollow since. Thomas Hutchkins made the bargain. But you do not carry his blood. Adoption. 2 generations passed. The lineage was broken. Oh God. Bill's grandfather had been adopted. I vaguely remembered my own grandfather mentioning it once, a scandal involving an unwed mother and a childless couple desperate for an heir. The Hutchkins name had continued, but the bloodline had changed. We didn't know, Constance said, voice strained. The records were lost. The adoption was sealed. Nobody alive remembers. Ignorance does not void obligation. 7 bloodlines were promised. Only 6 stand before me. The bargain cannot be fulfilled with incomplete payment. Then take me anyway, Bill said, stepping forward with a kind of courage only old men who've stopped fearing death possess. I came here willing. I came here knowing what it meant. If my blood's not right, so be it. But my intention is. Intention is insufficient. The original bargain specified bloodlines, not volunteers. Without the seventh, the debt remains. The hollow thing seemed to grow, shadows pooling around it like liquid. You have wasted my patience. You have failed to deliver what was promised. Now I take not 7, but 70. Not willing, but screaming. The entire town becomes my feast. The symbols flickered. The boundary was failing. Wait. I shouted, mind racing through options, through journal entries, through everything I'd learned about bargains and entities and the rules governing supernatural exchanges. The original bargain specified 7 bloodlines, yes. But it didn't specify which generation. It didn't say the 7th had to be here tonight. The hollow thing paused. Explain. Bill Hutchkins carries the name but not the blood. Fine. But Thomas Hutchkins had other descendants, children, grandchildren, people who moved away from Ashwood Hollow but still carry his true lineage. Give us time to find them. Give us until next thin times to locate the 7th bloodline and bring them here. Trickery. Delay. Another year of feeding while you search. No trick. No delay. Just the terms of the original agreement being honored correctly. I pulled out my phone, pulled up ancestry websites I'd bookmarked during my research. Look, Thomas Hutchkins had 3 children. One stayed in Ashwood Hollow, the line Bill descends from. But the other 2 moved to Virginia and Tennessee. Those lines still exist. They're documented, traceable, alive. The hollow thing considered this, and I felt it sifting through my thoughts again, checking for deception, finding none, because I was telling the truth, desperately improvising but honest in my intent. You propose to locate the true Hutchkins descendant and return with them next January? Yes. And if you fail? If the 7th cannot be found or refuses to come? Then you take everyone. The whole town. No limitations, no rules, no boundaries. Complete permission to feed until sated. I ignored Constance's sharp intake of breath, ignored the horror on my companions' faces. But if we succeed, if we bring you the 7th bloodline, willing and aware, you honor the original bargain. 7 for freedom. 7 for peace. 7 so Ashwood Hollow can finally be free of the debt. The silence stretched so long I thought I'd failed. Thought the hollow thing would reject the proposal and begin its feeding frenzy. The symbols were barely glowing now, almost extinguished. Then. Acceptable. 1 year. Next thin times. 7 bloodlines correctly identified, willingly given. Failure means total consumption. Success means debt satisfied, and my return to the spaces between worlds. The entity began to collapse in on itself, folding through dimensions I couldn't track. Before it vanished completely, it spoke one more time. Do not disappoint me again, Hargrove. My patience has limits, and you have found their edge. Then it was gone. The symbols died. The temperature normalized. We stood in a circle around the mine entrance. 7 people who'd prepared to die, who'd been granted a reprieve so precarious it might have been kinder to refuse it. Bill Hutchkins was on his knees, hands shaking worse than my father's ever had. I'm sorry. Christ, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. None of us knew, Paula said, helping him stand. You came here willing. That matters. It doesn't matter to that thing. Bill looked at the mine entrance, at the hole that had sealed itself as the hollow thing departed. I condemned the whole town by being here under false pretenses. You bought us time, I corrected. Now we use it. We walked back through Ashwood Hollow as it gave way to February 1st, the thin times ending with our town still standing, still breathing, still ignorant of how close they'd come to annihilation. Alice was waiting at the station, eyes red from crying she'd obviously done while we were gone. You're alive, she said, voice cracking. All of you? How? I explained while she made coffee none of us would drink, while the others sat in chairs too stunned to move. When I finished, Alice stared at me like I'd grown a second head. So instead of solving the problem, you negotiated a 1-year extension and promised the hollow thing a feast if we fail to deliver. That about sums it up. Jamie, that's insane. That's... She stopped, ran hands through her hair. That's also probably the only reason we're all still alive. Okay. We have a year. How do we find the real Hutchkins descendant? My name is Jameson Hargrove, and this is where my story pauses. Not ends, but pauses. Because in 11 months, I'll stand at that mine entrance again with 6 others. And a 7th we haven't yet found. A stranger carrying blood they don't know connects them to a debt made 164 years ago. Someone who'll have to choose between their life and the lives of 847 people they've never met. If you know anyone descended from Thomas Hutchkins, who had family that moved to Virginia or Tennessee in the 1850s, if you have information that could help us find that 7th bloodline, leave it in the comments. Because next January, the hollow thing will be waiting. And this time, it won't accept excuses. This is Sheriff Jameson Hargrove of Ashwood Hollow, West Virginia. Stay safe out there. And remember, some debts can only be postponed, never forgiven.